It can only be attributable to human error.
You're entering paranormal.
He meddled in things that you people. He meddled in things. He meddled in things.
Where will we go next? Just phantom from another time.
No one, Mr. Mulder.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
That is one big pile of shit.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Cryptid Campfire Tall Tales. It's me, Eli Watson, your solo camping expert. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to gut a fish after catching it. Just kidding. It's today I'm going to be talking about another Sasquatch-like being like I did last week. But this time, not in the Deep South, not in the Pacific Northwest, but in Arizona. That is right, everyone. We're talking about the Mogollon Monster. What is up with this Mogollon Monster, dude? Who knows? We're about to find out. According to Wikipedia, the Mogollon Monster is a Sasquatch-like creature, as I just stated, around 7 feet tall, which is Sasquatch range, brownish to reddish hair. It has a strong odor of, get this, a dead fish, a skunk, decaying peat moss, and the musk of a snapping turtle. Now that is quite the combination, and I cannot quite imagine all of those smells. But if you can, that's what it smells like. It's said to be nocturnal. That's another very Sasquatch-like trait. Oh, and I should throw this out there. A lot of the sightings of the Mogollon Monster take place in the early 20th century. So the term Sasquatch didn't even come around till, I think, the 1950s, if not the 1940s. So the reason why we say it's a Sasquatch-like creature and not Sasquatch itself is because people didn't call it Sasquatch for a long time. It's more one of those kinds of Sasquatch-like creatures that fall into the category of a wild man. So that's what we're dealing with. And I'm going to be just comparing some of these characteristics to Sasquatch-like creatures and information that we know about them or that we've kind of gathered in the past couple of years. So, very territorial, very violent sometimes. As some Sasquatches, I mean, if you take the Ape Canyon incident, that was a show of aggression and territorial defense. Footprints are around 22 inches in length. Supposedly, they can mimic birds, coyotes, and other wildlife with noises. That is not a common one I've heard about Sasquatch creatures, but that is one I have heard. They whistle, which is one I've heard. Explore campsites after dark. Sasquatch-like creatures tend to be very curious, so investigating campsites. And I'm not talking about like going straight up to the campfire and sitting down like our logo shows, but just kind of watching from a distance, trying to see what's up, what's going on in your territory, basically. They're able to build nests out of pine needles, twigs, and leaves. Now that's interesting because if you take into account the Albert Ostman account, he was a man, I think it was in the early 20th century. He was kidnapped by some Sasquatches in the middle of the night and lived with a family of Sasquatch for about a week. And he reported that they were able to weave their beds and weave their pillows. And so I think it's an interesting parallel that the Mogollon Monster is able to reportedly build nests out of pine needles and twigs and leaves and all that. They hurl stones while hidden from view. There's several reports. I mean, the rock apes of Vietnam, the Ape Canyon incident, Even James Bobo Faye's own account in Bluff Creek reports rocks being thrown. They are said to decapitate deer, and other wildlife before eating it. Now, that's not one I've heard before. I have heard about some deer mutilations going on caused by Sasquatch-like creatures. Well, they'll like rip it in half and stow it up in a tree or something crazy like that. It was actually Cliff Barrickman of Finding Bigfoot who drew my attention to that. They sometimes emit a blood-curdling scream. As we all know, Sasquatch vocalizations can be quite scary. People also report a stillness before an encounter, where everything will go quiet. I think that's also super interesting, that the forest will quiet down while one of these is in the area. So, that brings us to folklore, really. I mean, as you know, co-host Stephen Myers is from Arizona. I have a couple of other buddies who are also from Arizona, and they've heard about the Mogollon Monster very little. When they were in the Boy Scouts, it was a story that was told to them. So, and I have a couple of stories, and I'm only going to share like a few. If you really want to get into the Mogollon Monster stories, I have a book to recommend to you. It's called The Mogollon Monster, Arizona's Bigfoot by Susan Farnsworth. Definitely worth a look, because in her own words, it's a collection of campfire stories told about the Mogollon Monster. So it's chock full of good stuff. So here's a story about a pioneer named Sam Spade. Supposedly, Sam Spade was building a log cabin on land adjacent to what is now Camp Geronimo. He was attacked by the Mogollon Monster and mentally broken for the rest of his life. His son, Bill Spade, and his wife were killed by the monster on their wedding day, which is awful. And supposedly, the beast is still out there looking for its next victim. In another telling of that same story, Bill Spade was attacked at night, with no trace being left behind except for Bill Spade's face, which had been torn off and left on a tree. Which is pretty nuts, if you ask me, and pretty awful. Bad way to go out. There's other stories about the origins of the Mogollon Monster. One is that it's a Native American who is hell-bent on revenge and has taken the form of the monster. Others say that it's the phantom of a white man who killed a native woman. And as punishment, he was tied to a tree by his hands and stretched to the height of 8 feet, skinned, and then left to die. Damned by the spirits, he is cursed to walk the woods, misnamed the Skinwalker, which raises a bunch of different questions like, skinwalkers, what? But we're not getting into that in this here tall tale. That's for another day. So that's just a couple of the stories. There's honestly a lot of stories, but I figure I'll get into some of the sightings now, because there are some pretty crazy ones. So I'll start here. In around 1944, because for a long time this was considered the first report of the Mogollon Monster. So it begins with a cryptozoologist named Don Davis. Of course, this was before he was a cryptozoologist. He was around 13 years old at the time. And Don Davis just passed away in 2002. R.I.P. So he was part of the Boy Scouts, much like my friends and much like Stefan, of course, in 1944. And he was up near Payson, Arizona, where he had his own experience. So supposedly what had happened was he and his fellow Boy Scouts were camping over near Tonto Creek, and something woke him up. Dave noticed that there was something going through their stuff, and he thought it might be one of the other Boy Scouts. So he just kind of yelled at them to knock it off. And whatever this thing was just walked over to him and stood right above his sleeping bag looking down on him. And so Davis just kind of like hid himself in the covers, or in his sleeping bag, my bad. And he says, the creature was huge. Its eyes were deep set and hard to see, but they seemed expressionless. His face seemed pretty much devoid of hair, but there seemed to be hair along the sides of his face. His chest, shoulders, and arms were massive, especially the upper arms. Easily upwards of 6 inches in diameter, perhaps much, much more. I could see he was pretty hairy, but didn't observe really how thick the body hair was. The face/head was very square sides, and squared up chin, like a box. So there's that. Is that something that inspired Don Davis to potentially get into cryptozoology? Probably. I don't know. Pretty crazy experience if you ask me. I mean, apparently nothing happened. I didn't really get a whole lot of information on this. I'll be 100% honest. It was really difficult to find information on Don Davis, much less his encounter, so I'm surprised that I even pulled up what I did. But as I said, this was for a long time considered the first report of the Mogollon Monster, but there's actually one discovered just recently, I want to say within the past 5 to 6 years, that actually predates Don Davis's own account. And I'm kind of on the fence about this myself, and you'll see why probably in a minute, but it is a story told in the Arizona Republic in the year 1903 by a man named I.W. Stevens. So I.W. Stevens was on a business trip. He ended up in the southern region of the Grand Canyon, which is Mojave County, Arizona. And Stevens broke his arm at one point during this trip, and so he was resting up, and with the help of his friend, they built this little skiff so he could just kind of sail down the river through the canyon. So he travels down the canyon a little bit. His arm's better by this point, and he pulls off, and he notices bare feet tracks in the sand, and he thinks it's a Native American, but yeah, they just kind of disappear, and then he sees them again, so he's just kind of wary of the situation. He found nothing more, so he stays in this spot. I think he stays for about 3 days, if I'm understanding the story correctly, and on the 3rd day, he says that he sees a man on a bench of rocks on the north side of the river. So basically he's looking across the river, and he sees up on this cliff there's a person up there. And so he decides that he's going to ride his little skiff up the stream so he can kind of get behind him, whoever this person is, and climb up there and get a better look at them. And so he finally gets up there, and he describes, and I'm going to just read the rest of the account at this point, but he says it was sitting on a large boulder, a man with long white hair and a matted beard that reached to his knees. The creature was unaware of my approach, and I gazed upon him for some moments unobserved. He was about 50 yards away and in full view. He wore no clothing, and upon his talon-like fingers were claws at least 2 inches long. A coat of gray hair nearly covered his body, with here and there a spot of dirty skin showing. I had found the wild man of the rocks. At that moment, a rock, loosened by some animal, came rolling down. The creature turned his face towards me. Horrors! What a face! It was seared and burned brown by the sun with fiery green eyes. With a wild whoop and a leap, he was up over rocks and cliffs like a mountain sheep for about 75 yards. Then he stopped. He was armed with a queer-shaped club, large enough to fell an ox. Brandishing this bludgeon, he shrieked and chattered for a moment, then started toward me, roaring and still flourishing his weapon. Faster and faster he came, and my hair began to stiffen. I am a poor runner, so I stood my ground. When the creature was within about 15 yards of me, I raised my rifle to fire, thinking to cripple him. As I glanced along the barrel, I heard a growl just above the wild man. He also had heard the growl and braced himself for the shock. I drew a hasty bead on the cougar and pressed the trigger. When the smoke had cleared away, the mother cougar lay dead where the wild man stood. The man himself had disappeared. The 2 young cougars were still on the rocks, apparently greatly frightened by the report and echoes of my old Sharps rifle. Reaching hastily for a cartridge, I found I had neglected to buckle on my belt when leaving camp. So I hastily retreated to the boat, where I found everything as I had left it. I shoved the boat off and drifted toward camp, which was near the cougars. There lay the old cougar where she had fallen. The wild man was standing over the 2 cubs, which were also dead. He had beat the life out of them with a club. He stood a moment gazing on the carcasses, then got down on hands and knees and drank the warm blood as it flowed from the death wounds. The sight sickened me. I stood up in the boat and yelled. The man sprang to his feet, took a long look at me, then fled up from ledge to ledge until he reached the 4th ledge, where he stopped. Here he flourished his club again and screamed the wildest, most unearthly screech I ever heard, then turned and sprang up the craggy wall of the canyon. Not fancying my wild neighbor, I packed my outfit into the boat and drifted down out of the canyon before I made for the night. That was the strangest adventure of my life. Tradition records that years ago, hostile Indians captured 3 men, bound them to logs far up the canyon, and cast them adrift upon the swollen river. It may be that this wild creature is one of those unfortunate men who, by chance, freed himself and escaped death, but was made insane by his awful experience. I don't know, dude, something to think about. What gets me about this report is that the creature has a club, and the man is insistent, or Mr. Stevens is insistent, that it is a man, and not some sort of creature or wild man of the woods. It's quite literally just a wild man, despite, I think as he describes, being completely covered in hair. Is it possible that it could be a wild man, a person who just went rogue or survived some sort of Native American punishment and just went completely bonkers out there? Absolutely. Is it a Sasquatch-like creature? Can I say with any confidence? No, I cannot. But I think it's interesting, and I think it's an interesting piece of the lore of the Mogollon Monster. Those 2 stories I just shared, those reports, are both very old, and believe it or not, there's actually been some more recent reports than that. So in 2006, the White Mountain Apache Nation told Tucson.com that there has been more sightings than ever before of the Mogollon Monster. So many that you can't ignore it. So Marjorie Grimes, who lives in Whitewater, which is a town on the reservation, has seen it multiple times. The first time being in 1982, and her most recent at the time of writing the article, or when the article came out, was 2004. And not only that, Marjorie isn't alone in her sightings. I didn't get many details on what those sightings are, but her son has had a sighting, her neighbor has had a sighting, and so on and so forth. And you get the idea that a shit ton of people have seen it. Excuse my language. But I think that's very interesting. I know Finding Bigfoot, the television show, I already brought it up once on this episode. They had an episode where they went and looked for the Mogollon Monster themselves. A man named Dolan Ellis, which is Arizona State's official balladeer since 1966, has a song called The Mogollon Monster, which is all about don't litter in the woods, basically, is the message of the song. Or ballad, I guess you would call it, since he's a balladeer. The Mogollon Monster is often not taken seriously at all. But I'll share this as well before we start wrapping up this episode. I am part of a television series called Chasing Legends, which is hosted by a man named Nash Hoover, who's actually been on the show. If you guys want to know more about Chasing Legends and what it's all about, check out the Nash Hoover episode and the Nash Hoover and Alex Pedikov episode, because they're both hosts, Alexander Pedikov and Nash Hoover, and now I'm joining the series as well. And my first episode was actually in Payson, Arizona, which is near Don Davis's own sighting. And we went on to the Mogollon Rim to, basically go squatching and look for the Mogollon Monster. And while I cannot say that I personally found anything that's gonna make anyone believe, I did hear some strange noises. There definitely seemed like there was something out there. I know there was elk in the area, so that was really cool. First time I ever saw an elk. What we were hearing, so Pedikov reported that he heard a knock and actually recorded it, so that will probably be in the finished episode. I was not in that area. We split up into 2 different groups. Pedikov and another team member went off in one direction, and me and Nash Hoover went into a different one. And me and Nash were getting drawn further and further into the woods by these weird... It sounded like something was walking through the woods, like snapping tree branches and stuff like that, which doesn't seem very characteristic of an elk to purposely make noise, right? I know I heard something on this hill, and I can't really explain what it was, because the elk was... We were in this dry creek bed, and the elk were on the other side of the creek bank, and I'm not dispelling the possibility that one of them could have crossed the dry creek bed, walked up the hill, and walked past us. That's very possible, maybe even probable. But considering there was a tree knock coming from the area, and the fact that I heard something upon the hill that was moving, and then once I kind of told everyone what I was hearing, it stopped and went on for just a second and then stopped again. I don't know, I thought it was strange, but who knows? That episode's set to air in 2021 on YouTube, and I'll be sure to share it on the Cryptid Campfire page, so you guys can watch it. Anyways, I think that's about it for the Mogollon Monster. It's a tall tale indeed, but I definitely think the area on the Mogollon Rim is definitely dense enough, it's definitely large enough to host a Sasquatch-like creature. 5 sure. If you guys like this episode, be sure to... what am I saying? You guys already love our episodes. This is a tall tale. Well, thank you, everyone. If you guys want to find me on the onlines, that's at the Eli Watson on Instagram and Twitter, actually, now that I'm back. You guys take it easy, and I'll catch you next week. We're doing another interview with the Folklore this upcoming Tuesday, so be sure to tune in for that. She's a Sasquatch expert, probably the smartest person I know about the Sasquatch species at the moment, so you guys keep an eye out for it. Anyways, take it easy.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.